Hello, yes. Today I want to discuss Keith Hollinshead's concept of world making, which has been highly influential in critical tourism studies. And I want to do this from two different angles. One is the analytical / theoretical, just highlight some transitions and also internal contradictions in the concept and as it was developed. And the other one is going to be the applied one, how it can be applied to understand heritage tourism, how heritage tourism can be designed, in what ways, in what styles, and to what ends. So here is a fulsome, I would say, definition of world making by Keith himself. It refers to the creative and often false or full imaginative processes and projective promotional activities which management agencies and other mediating bodies engage in to purposely or otherwise unconsciously privilege particular dominant, favored representations of peoples, places, pasts within a given region, area, or world over and above other actual or potential representations of those subjects. That's a mouthful, but it is actually quite good. And as you can see, I highlighted some words which are, in my opinion, concepts. In fact, I would say that these concepts nicely highlight different aspects of world making. Some of them were nicely highlighted in Keith's oeuvre, and other ones were forgotten or never mentioned at all or developed very late, unfortunately. The constructionist element is very important, and I think it's one of the most developed ones. It's highlighted in the false or four representations. The other one that is nicely developed is the institutional aspect, which is referred to in agencies and mediating bodies that do the representation. So there is a media studies element in the definition of world making, which was developed a bit late, around 2018, and this is in the influential, I think, and I personally like it very much, article that Keith co-authored with Ruqeya Suleiman. Then another one that is also very nicely highlighted is the concept of hegemony, which appears in the dominant and favored representations that are debated by Keith. And then, of course, there is the nexus of who is being represented, people and landscapes or worlds, who does what to whom in other ways. The things that haven't really been picked up on by Keith are the idea of imagination. This came very late in his work, not before 2021, I would say, in any kind of constructive and organized way. And this came in the trilogies, the trilogy of articles that he published with other colleagues. And the other thing that was never really brought to the fore is the idea of habitus or hexes, this kind of repetitive, customary things that are done in the design of tourism, which appears in this definition under purposely or unconsciously mediated designs. And maybe we have time later to discuss those. I have a special interest in them because they connect to particular social theories, mostly Marxist, but not only, prominently the work of Pierre Bourdieu, of course, on habitus, of which I am actually quite critical, but anyway. So let's see what in practice, what went into the organization of the concept. And it happened, as I said, it happened in phases. Not all of it appears at once. And I will give you the phases as well in a while. But I divide basically the main influences into two clusters. The first cluster is that is associated mostly with post-structuralism, post-colonialism, and a little bit decolonialism, not much. This comes much later, actually, in what Keith actively does as a theorist. So he used a lot Michel Foucault's work. Of course, the idea of authority partly connects to Foucault's work, connects to other things as well that contradict or kind of don't quite match what Foucault does. But the idea of the carcerality of power comes um, very close to what Keith is going to define later, world-making authority. Um, the influence of Michel Foucault, who is a philosopher, kind of language as a form of association. And his notion of identification, how people identify with things, including institutions, but not only, to acquire an identity, and therefore the materiality, let's say, of identity making comes to the fore in the world making kind of organization of tourism. And of course, Homi Bhabha's kind of work, um, especially his concept of enunciation and third space, have been very influential on Keith. He is interested basically in the ways that cultures become, as collective practices, through utterance, the things that we say, which produce a kind of third space in which people meet and make. So the world making dimension doesn't really come, as some people think, from the work of Goodman, but from this post-colonial kind of theories more so. And also the Marxists and the anti-humanists of the like of Foucault. The first tension, therefore, that is generated is that in his work between structure and agency. And in fact, later Keith is going to talk about the ways structured discourses organized by the nation state, by institutions, um, uh, can be kind of juxtaposed with more quotidian forms of world making, which reconfigure these discourses. But the discourses don't really go away, and that's significant as well. But here's what we don't get clearly in his work. Um, when we are talking about the workings of power, should we prioritize institutions? Do institutions do things to people? Or do we deal with discourses that circulate in culture and society in kind of invisible ways, um, and make humans, um, subject humans to power and make them perform particular versions of identity? And this tension actually is a tension that you find in social theory. Um, the institutional dimension is more Marxist and thinks of power as material and materialized, whereas the discursive kind of dimension is a more kind of diffusive. It's a diffusive model that you will find in the workings of Foucault. So what is really going on uh, within this kind of world-making kind of over that Keith is developing? Um, And some say that, you could resolve these contradictions and problems if you go back to the work of Louis Althusser, who is another first generation critical theorist, but I would say maybe not, possibly. We can discuss that. Also, bear in mind that the emphasis here is between, it focuses on a binary. It's between structure and agency. Um, how exactly can we transfer this to actual tourist systems? Well, of course, there's also the question, is there one tourism system or many? But how can we think analytically about it, about the tourist system through the world-making power of tourism? And in fact, to sector reconstruct, this is where Keith comes from. He is a constructivist who's trying to kind of marry constructivism, the production of reality, with realism. I'm not sure that he was sure that there was a particular version of realism to which he subscribed, and I will explain in a while why. There are different ones in his work, but that's the basics. He is a constructivist and a kind of realist. Um, his PhD was The Truth About Texas, a naturalistic study of the construction of heritage, in which basically he presented the narratorial construction of truth about the ways culture and place are when we privilege one particular storyline. And of course, he's interested in the ways agencies constructed particular areas in terms of heritage. Um, there is a vague kind of connection to world making, but actually, what he's doing is not what Nelson Goodman purports in his work. Uh, Quite the contrary, actually, this is a very straightforward reading of Goodman, like the ones that you get in the social policy manuals that Nicholas Rose, for example, produced. It's about basically making policy. It's not Goodman. Um, uh, but back then, actually, Keith was very interested basically in precisely that, how the vision of the policymaker in tourism concentrates on something. And this is the reason why he was so interested also in John Ehren's work on the tourist gaze, which he matched mostly, and this is his main contribution at the time, with post-colonial kind of readings of tourism, of place and culture. So he mastered with post-colonial critiques of power and knowledge, which come directly from Foucault, which you will find actually in the original tourist gaze thesis. So the first and second edition of Ferry's work, not so much the third one. But here is a slide then back to classical Marxism. All these kind of post-structuralist and post-modern kind of dimensions in his work disappear at the start, I would say, of the 21st century, when he becomes more associated and engaged with people who promote the paradigm of the Academy of Hope. And this is a more kind of classical Marxian view of the ways the world is made by capitalism and by institutions. So discourse takes kind of the backseat, and institutions return. So that was the first cluster of influences. The second cluster is really interesting, not less because Keith, when we met, because I was very interested in Goodman and his work on world making and star making, which has been taken up also by scientists. Um, He told me that world making is a heuristic device for me. I wasn't thinking about Goodman, but of course Goodman, Keith being Keith, a polymath, he also included Goodman in his work, as it were, because it was relevant. But Goodman is not a phenomenologist, first of all, and he's not a constructivist, as we understand it traditionally. He's what we call phenomenalist. Phenomenalism is of his own making. Basically, what Goodman says is that all world versions are valid and truthful within contexts, and as they are held by particular individuals, subjects, and communities that uphold the same values, and therefore they have a kind of attraction and likeness in their views. Okay, that's different from what Keith is actually arguing when he uses world making. So the thesis on world making moves from classical realist kind of accounts of the world, how the world is, how it's made by capitalism, money, to a more tentative realist analysis of what is possible, let's say. That's why I find it more interesting and attractive, because it comes much closer to the study of utopia, of the not yet, which can be actually quite useful when it comes to the design of the future. So we have the kind of emphasis on the coexistence of multiple worlds or many worlds. This kind of ally allows people to also adopt different variables, let's say, and different emphasis on what they study. In this case, let's think about tourism specifically. For Keith, actually, ethnic diversity is the priority. He's thinking in terms of the nation state, in terms of ethnic and ethno-religious, in some cases, cosmology. This is his emphasis. He said very little, if anything, on gender, class, or disability in his work. So bear this in mind. He was actually getting there, addressing these more holistically, I guess, different variables in his work, and he did it in the usual Keith style through collaborative publications, and the most prominent ones, I would say, would be the 3 articles that were published in 2021, which they were termed as trilogy of strategies of disruption in research methodologies. I think these are tentative methodologies. It's more an epistemological statement, what you get. If there is a methodological value in anything that is said in these articles, it is done through other people's work, but then there is nothing applied in them. There are more examples. So, still, he started together with colleagues such as Ruqayya Suleiman, Men, Bella, and others. I started thinking of the production of vocabulary, that new vocabulary in critical thinking, that can address an ethics of pluralism, and of course transdisciplinary methodologies are quite suited for this. There are other ones, and I would go back to the original world-making thesis that provides other possibilities. But in any case, the interesting thing is that what he doesn't go away from, doesn't want to escape, is the post and the colonial theory. And in fact, quite a lot of these terms that appear in these 3 articles are quite mainstream in the colonial theory. They are not made up in other ways. But again, there is little explicit mention of variables bar ethnicity. This is done mainly through references to other scholars, and this takes us back to the epistemic ethos, I guess, of what this group of people do here. Which is mostly post and decolonial. So there are limitations in what you get in Keith's world-making concept. So, for example, other interventions that focus on gender, or in some cases also, I would say, cosmology, religion, you would find, and of course, the new post-humanist kind of genres in critical tourism analysis. These are mentioned in this trilogy, but they are mentioned through other people's work and not very well developed. Again, to reiterate, here we have two clusters of influences, and they are not necessarily compatible. Well, they can become, but we need to discuss this. The first cluster focuses on the kind of hegemonic or discursive institutions of place and culture in tourism, and this stems from variations of conflict theory. The second one is closer to consensus theory, and emphasizes the possibility of coexistence of different versions, ways of life, different worlds. There is a couple of questions one could ask really. What kind of thesis is this? Does it work on variations of utopia, possibilities that may become realities in the future? Does it emphasize an ethics of hospitality in flux? Of course, work making has this processual dimension. Does it endeavor to facilitate justice, and for whom? Is it for ethnicities only? Or is it a form of imaginary planning only? And we should stop there. This is still a contribution. I have to emphasize that the split between social policy and theory doesn't do it for me. And when it becomes qualitative, they're both valuable contributions. So there is no hierarchical evaluation there. So, okay, let's apply all these things, or some of them, because this symposium's theme is on heritage tourism, and we have to do that, really. So what kinds of heritage worlds does tourism world making promise or can produce? And there are different versions, not all of them are pleasant. I highlight lacks limitations mostly, and we will talk more about the promises. The promises are embedded, actually. They come hand in hand with the limitations. The first version is, if we think about tourism authority predominantly in Keith's terms, then heritage becomes a materially guarded dominion by the state, and the state wins in more than one ways, controls the world or tourism worlds. There isn't much said actually in Keith's work about the markets and whether we have actually arrived at the point at which markets matter more than the nation state, and the control that nation states used to have has been taken over really by network capitalism. That's one point we can discuss. So the second version would be heritage if we start thinking about it in cosmological terms. So basically what different societies and cultures believe in, the set self-beliefs and values. And this would include religion. And some would say, oh, this is a bit more emancipatory. I would say that actually this is bogus. It's quite the opposite in some cases. Instead of having tourism authority and the state, what you have is culture dominating, and dominant versions of culture exist even within small groups, and they kill and they destroy other minority, let's say, groups, or the less kind of powerful, let's say, clusters. Um, the other version of heritage is, again, a bit institutional, but it's more the spirit, really, of collaboration. We start thinking through the idea of world making in terms of world collaborations in heritage that can be mediated through international coordinators, arbitrators of heritage. Um, Again, there is an issue there. Who guards the guardians, as it were? Who speaks on behalf of whom, and so on and so forth. And the fourth version of heritage, which can apply in the kind of traditional communitas, let's say, version of world making, but also in a more academic and intellectual version, basically how paradigms are formed within tourism analysis to uphold whatever values. Heritage here is understood as a nomadic and cosmopolitan ethos. And of course, Keith, with colleagues, did talk about post-identity, especially through the Deleuzian kind of traditional post-identity. But there are also some other objections there, and especially some feminists, critical feminist tourism scholars would object to it, because the Deleuzian kind of nomadism is a quintessential masculine fantasy of the white middle class traveler. Uh, be as it may, it is a version. Thank you for listening.